The millionaire never expected that request. He had enough money to buy whatever he wanted, power to solve anything. But on the day his daughter almost died, the person who saved her life was a poor boy selling candy on the street. The millionaire tried to thank him the only way he knew how, by offering money. But the boy refused. And the request he made in return, the millionaire never saw it coming. And that's what turned his world upside down. Colton Vance knew exactly how much everything in his life cost. The imported car, the Swiss watch, the beachfront apartment, everything could be calculated. What he didn't know was the price of what mattered most. Maybe because he'd never cared to find out. His daughter, Elodie Vance, just 8 years old, was a quiet presence in his daily routine. He paid for the best school, the most qualified nanny, the most expensive toys. But at the end of the day, all Elodie wanted was something he never offered: time. That Saturday, Colton had an important meeting. He left Elodie in the care of Ivy Langston, a nanny who seemed more interested in her phone than the little girl. The park was crowded, but all it took was 1 second of distraction. Elodie ran after a red balloon the wind had carried away. She crossed into a quieter area, got close to a canal with murky water, and as she reached for the balloon, she slipped. She fell. The impact was fast, the panic even faster. Screams echoed, but no one moved. Until a skinny boy with a plastic bag full of candy slung over his shoulder ran toward her. Asher Doyle, 12 years old, was selling sweets to help support his sick mother. He didn't think twice. He dropped the bag on the ground and jumped into the water. The cold was biting, the current strong, but he held onto Elodie with everything he had. He pulled her to the edge, gasping for breath, shivering, but never letting go. Colton arrived running, his suit drenched in sweat, his face pale with fear. He grabbed his daughter in his arms, checking if she was breathing. She was alive. Without even looking at Asher, Colton pulled out his wallet. He took out $100 bill and held it out to the boy. Asher glanced at the money. His gaze was direct, steady, filled with something Colton didn't recognize: dignity. There was no anger, no arrogance, just a disarming simplicity. "I don't want money," Asher said softly, but with absolute certainty. Colton was stunned. Money always fixed everything. "Then what do you want?" he asked, impatient. Asher shrugged, still breathless from the effort. His eyes were red from the cold, but there was a raw honesty there, impossible to ignore. "Nothing. I just wish someone would do the same for my mom." The billionaire stood there, speechless. Asher picked up his bag of soggy candy, gave Colton one last quick glance. Not the look of someone expecting something, but of someone who knew they'd already done enough, and walked away without looking back. That night, Colton couldn't sleep. The boy's face, his refusal, and those simple words echoed in his mind. The millionaire never expected that request, but what he would hear next would change everything. The sound of the door slamming was the last thing Colton Vance heard before locking himself away in silence that night. The luxury apartment, filled with glass and marble, felt empty despite Elodie sleeping safely in her room. She was saved, alive. But for the first time, that didn't bring him any relief. The boy's face from the park haunted Colton's mind. That steady gaze, the unexpected refusal, and those simple words. "I just wish someone would do the same for my mom." There was something in those words no amount of money could erase. Across the city, far from the bright buildings and clean streets, Asher Doyle walked home barefoot. His shoes were still wet, tossed by the door. He carried a bag of soaked candies, now useless for selling. The smell of melted sugar mixed with dirty street water clung to the thin plastic. Asher stepped into the tiny apartment he shared with his mother, Maeve Doyle. The space was cramped, with peeling walls and a mattress pushed into a corner. Maeve was coughing, a dry, tired cough she tried to hide since the diagnosis, but Asher knew. He knew without having to ask. "Hey, champ," Maeve smiled, forcing a lightness her frail body couldn't carry. "How'd the sales go today?" Asher hesitated. He glanced at the wet bag, then at his mother, who needed that money for medicine. He smiled back, a crooked smile filled with a strength far too big for a 12-year-old boy. "Sold almost everything. Just a few left," he said, carefully setting the bag down to keep her from noticing the damage. Maeve tried to sit up, but her weak body wouldn't cooperate. Asher rushed to her side, gently holding her thin shoulders. His touch was light, almost afraid he might break her. "It's okay, Mom. Just rest." Maeve looked into her son's eyes. She knew he was lying, but pretended to believe him. It was the kind of lie love accepts because the truth hurts more. Meanwhile, Colton stared at the ceiling of his own room. He couldn't sleep. Asher's face was still there, like a shadow burned into his memory. It wasn't just the boy's refusal of money. It was his clarity, the invisible strength behind such simple words. The next morning, Colton got up early, something rare for him on weekends. He dressed simply but with the precision of a man heading to an important meeting. Only this time, it wasn't a contract he wanted to close. It was an answer. He went back to the park, searching for the candy boy. He walked along the sidewalks, scanned the street corners, until on a narrow street, he saw Asher. The boy was standing next to a traffic light, holding a new bag of cheap candy, his face serious and focused. Colton approached, unsure of what to say. Asher spotted him and frowned, surprised but not scared. "You again?" Asher asked, adjusting the bag on his shoulder. Colton didn't like feeling out of control, but there he was. No script, no plan. Standing in front of a boy who had nothing yet seemed to have everything. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Colton began, his voice lower than usual. "What did you mean by that?" Asher shrugged, the same simple gesture that seemed to carry an enormous weight. "I meant exactly what I said." Colton took a deep breath, frustrated by the simplicity of the answer. He was used to complex negotiations, but nothing felt more complicated than this conversation. "Do you want something? Money? Food? I can help your family." Asher looked at Colton with a mix of weariness and impatience. After a brief silence, he replied, "I don't want any of that. I just wanted to know what it's like to have a dad." The words hit Colton like a punch to the gut. There was nothing he could buy to answer that. Colton stood there in silence, staring at the boy who, without effort, exposed the biggest failure of his life. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do. The millionaire never expected that request, but now there was no way to ignore it. Colton Vance was used to solving everything with money. In his mind, problems were just numbers waiting to be added, subtracted, or erased. But what do you do when the problem has no price? Asher Doyle's silence, that direct gaze, and his unexpected refusal kept echoing in Colton's head. It wasn't just what the boy had said. It was what he hadn't said. In the days that followed, Colton tried to distract himself with work. Meetings, contracts, million-dollar deals. But none of it filled the growing emptiness inside him. Asher's face would pop into his mind at the most unexpected moments. In the reflection of his office window, in the muffled sound of rain against the car's windshield, even in Elodie's soft laughter, as if she'd held on to the memory of the boy. Meanwhile, across town, Asher went back to his routine. Selling candy on the streets, taking care of his mother, pretending everything was fine. Maeve Doyle was still fighting an illness that crept silently, stealing a little more of her strength each day. Asher did his best to hide his fear because he knew that if he showed weakness, the little hope left in their home would disappear too. On a cold morning, Asher stood on a busy sidewalk with his bag of candy slung over his shoulder. The wind blew hard, scattering papers across the ground, while people rushed past, dodging him like he was invisible. That's when he saw Colton standing across the street, watching silently. The man crossed without hesitation. "Why are you following me?" Asher asked, not hiding his discomfort. Colton shoved his hands into his coat pockets, a gesture meant to mask the discomfort he felt himself. "I'm not following you. I just want to understand." Asher looked at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Understand what?" Colton was quiet for a few seconds, searching for the right words. "You saved my daughter. I tried to thank you the only way I know how, but you refused. Why?" Asher gave a short, almost ironic smile. "Because what you offered doesn't mean anything to me." The answer was direct, not meant to offend, but it hit Colton like an invisible punch. No one had ever said anything like that to him. Money had always been enough, for everyone, except for this boy. Colton took a deep breath. "Then what do you want?" Asher thought for a moment, staring at the ground, kicking a small pebble out of his path. Then he looked up again, with the same steady gaze. You want to know what I want? Fine. I wish my mom wasn't sick. I wish she could work without being in pain. I wish I didn't have to sell candy in the cold. But you can't give me any of that, can you? The silence between them was heavy, like the air itself had stopped. No, I can't, Colton admitted, lowering his gaze for the first time. Asher took a step back, ready to walk away, but then he stopped. But if you really want to do something, take me home with you today. Just for one day. I just want to know what it's like to have a dad, even if it's only for a few hours. Colton froze. The request was simple, but it carried a weight he wasn't sure he could handle. He didn't even know how to be a father to his own daughter. How could he pretend for a stranger? But something inside him, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, made him say, "All right." Asher seemed surprised for a second, but quickly gave a small nod, as if he didn't want to show how much it really meant to him. On the way to Colton's apartment, the contrast between their two worlds was striking. The luxury car, the uncomfortable silence, the cold shine of a modern apartment. Elodie ran to the door when she saw Asher, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "You came!" she exclaimed, hugging the boy without hesitation. Asher smiled back, a little awkward but clearly happy. For the first time in a long while, he felt welcome somewhere. Colton watched the scene with a tightness in his chest. It was simple, yet he didn't know how to be part of it. While Elodie showed Asher her drawings, Colton stood there, feeling like a stranger in his own home. The boy he thought he was helping was actually showing him something he never knew how to do. Connect? The day passed slowly, filled with small moments Colton couldn't ignore. Elodie's laughter, Asher's straightforward questions, and the kind of silence that felt more comforting than any important meeting. In the late afternoon, as Asher was getting ready to leave, Colton finally asked, "So, was this what you wanted?" Asher paused, looked at Colton, and gave a light smile, full of meaning. "It was more than I expected." Colton stood in silence as the boy walked out, the door closing softly behind him. But the emptiness that remained wasn't the same as before. The millionaire never expected that request, and now he knew why. In the days that followed, Colton Vance couldn't get Asher Doyle out of his mind. The boy had entered his life unexpectedly, with a simple request that stirred something Colton had always tried to ignore: the emptiness. The day they spent together might have seemed insignificant to the outside world, but for Colton, it was like opening a door that had been locked for years. Elodie talked about Asher often, describing how brave, funny, and different he was from anyone she'd ever met. For Colton, those conversations were uncomfortable. He wasn't used to dealing with emotions, let alone the idea that a poor boy could teach him anything. A man who believed he had it all. But the discomfort grew until it turned into curiosity. So, on a cloudy afternoon, Colton got in his car and drove aimlessly until he found himself in a modest neighborhood, far from the luxury he was used to. He stopped in front of an old building with peeling walls and cracked windows. There was Asher, sitting on the sidewalk with his bag of candy resting on his lap. The boy looked at him with the same steady gaze as always. No surprise, no fear. Colton got out of the car and walked over. "You again?" Asher said with a half-smirk, slightly mocking but not mean-spirited. Colton ignored the tone and got straight to the point. "You saved my daughter. I still feel like I owe you something." Asher sighed, fiddling with the bag as if tired of having this conversation. "I already told you. I don't want your money." Colton shook his head, frustrated. "Then what do you want?" Asher fell silent for a moment. His gaze drifted down the street, as if he was thinking about something he'd kept buried for a long time. Then he answered, without looking directly at Colton, "I want you to come to my house." The request caught Colton off guard. He'd expected anything but that. "Why?" he asked, suspicious. Asher finally met his eyes, those dark eyes reflecting something deeper than Colton could understand. "Just come." Colton hesitated, but he followed the boy into the modest building. They climbed a narrow staircase with worn steps and rusty railings. The hallway smelled of dampness and old paint. Asher opened the door to a small, dimly lit apartment. Inside, A thin, pale woman was lying on a mattress in the corner of the room. "Mom, this is the—" Asher paused, realizing he didn't even know Colton's full name. "The man I told you about." Maeve Doyle smiled, a weak smile, but filled with warmth. "So, you're the man who tried to pay my son for saving your daughter," she said lightly, despite the dry cough that interrupted her words. Colton didn't know what to say. He felt small, uncomfortable, out of place. Asher sat beside his mother, gently holding her hand. "He wanted to know what I wanted in return. I asked him to come here, just to see." Colton looked around. The space was simple, but there was something here he didn't have in his own home. Warmth, connection. Maeve coughed again, and Colton noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. "You don't have to feel sorry for us, Mr. Vance. We manage." But Colton didn't feel pity. He felt something much harder to admit. Shame. They didn't talk much. Maeve spoke about life, about the job she lost because of her illness, and Asher listened closely, holding her hand the entire time. There were no complaints, just a quiet acceptance of reality. When Colton stood up to leave, Asher walked him to the door. Before Colton could say anything, the boy spoke. "I didn't want you to see this out of pity. I wanted you to understand." Colton stood there for a moment, then replied quietly, "I understand." Back in his car, Colton glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Asher standing in the doorway, watching him. And for the first time, the millionaire realized there was something in life he couldn't control. The millionaire never expected that request. And now he understood that some debts can't be paid with money. Colton Vance's silence had never been an empty space. It was a shield, a place where he hid things he couldn't name. Guilt, regret, maybe even fear. But after visiting Asher and Maeve's apartment, that silence felt deafening. No matter how much he tried to drown it out with spreadsheets, contracts, and meetings, Maeve's tired face and Asher's steady gaze echoed in his mind, impossible to ignore. At home, Elodie talked about Asher more and more. To her, he wasn't just the boy who saved her life. He was a friend, someone who actually listened, something her own father rarely did. "Dad, why doesn't Asher come over anymore?" she asked one afternoon while drawing at the kitchen table. Colton took a while to respond. He didn't know. Maybe because it was easier to keep his distance than to face the discomfort of being around the boy. "He's probably busy," he replied, glancing at his phone, pretending not to notice the tightness in his chest. But something gnawed at him, and deep down, he knew he needed to see Asher again. The next day, Colton found himself back in that same modest neighborhood, hoping to spot the boy selling candy on the sidewalk. And there he was, the bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing slightly with suspicion as Colton approached. "What do you want now?" Asher asked bluntly. Colton took a deep breath. "I don't know. I just thought." He stopped, realizing he didn't have an answer. "Maybe you could show me more about your world." Asher gave a quick, half smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "My world? There's nothing to show." But for some reason, Asher led him around the neighborhood anyway. He pointed out the corner store where he bought bread when there was extra money, the small park where he used to play before his mom got sick, the alley where he sold more candy because the foot traffic was better. Each place held simple stories, but they were filled with a life Colton had never imagined. They ended up sitting on a park bench as the sun dipped low on the horizon. This time, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space where words mattered more. "You know my dad left before I was born?" Asher said suddenly, staring at the ground. "My mom never talked bad about him. She just said some people don't know how to stay." Colton swallowed hard. That hit deeper than he wanted to admit. "Do you miss him?" Colton asked softly. Asher shrugged, but this time, the gesture felt like it was hiding more than it revealed. "You can't miss something you never had." The weight of those words lingered in the air. Colton looked at the boy and, for the first time, saw something beyond the poor kid who saved his daughter. He saw a reflection of himself. Because, in some way, he never really knew what it was like to have a father either. Back at his apartment, Colton watched Elodie sleep, her face peaceful, unaware of the storm raging inside her father. He realized he was creating the same emptiness in her that he'd felt in his own childhood. The difference was, he still had time to change that. The next morning, Colton surprised Elodie with a simple question. Would you like Asher to spend the day with us? Her eyes lit up. Hours later, Asher was back in Colton's apartment. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, just a quiet discomfort between people still figuring out where they fit. Elodie pulled Asher into her world, showing him her drawings and toys. Colton watched from a distance, trying to understand how a boy with so little could fill so much space. At the end of the day, as Asher was getting ready to leave, he looked at Colton and said, "You know, you seem less empty today." Colton didn't know what to say, because deep down, the boy was right. The millionaire never expected that request, and now he understood that some truths don't need words to be felt. The air was heavy that morning. Asher Doyle woke up to the sound of his mother's cough echoing through their small apartment. It wasn't an ordinary cough. It was harsher, deeper. Like every breath Maeve took was a battle against her own body. Asher jumped out of bed, rushed to her side, and saw her pale face, cold sweat trickling down her forehead, and something in her eyes he had never seen before. Fear. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Maeve tried to smile, that same weak smile she always used to reassure him, but this time, it failed. She clutched her chest, struggling to breathe. "Just a little tired, sweetheart. It'll pass." But Asher knew it wouldn't pass. He grabbed the old phone from the table, and without thinking twice, dialed the only number that came to mind. Colton Vance. Across town, Colton was in an important meeting when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but seeing Asher's name on the screen made him pause. He answered with his usual impersonal tone, but the trembling voice on the other end told him something was wrong. "It's my mom. She can't breathe right. What do I do?" Asher's voice cracked, a mix of panic and desperation. Colton didn't hesitate. He left the meeting without a word, jumped into his car, and drove faster than he ever had. When he arrived at the small apartment, he found Maeve lying on the mattress, her face ghostly pale, her lips starting to turn bluish. Without a second thought, he carried her to the car, with Asher holding her hand in the back seat, trying desperately to keep her awake. At the hospital, the air felt even heavier. Doctors rushed Maeve through the emergency doors while Colton and Asher stood frozen in the sterile white corridor, the cold fluorescent lights making the emptiness of the moment feel even bigger. Asher didn't cry. He just sat silently, staring at the emergency room doors, his gaze fixed and lost. Colton stood beside him, unsure of what to say. The silence between them weighed more than any words could carry. Hours later, a doctor came out, his face serious, eyes heavy with the exhaustion of someone who's delivered bad news too many times. "She's stable for now, but the situation is critical. We'll need to keep her hospitalized. Her condition is complicated." Asher just nodded, as if he couldn't process the words. Colton placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a simple gesture, but it meant more than he realized. They were allowed to visit Maeve in her room. She was hooked up to machines, her skin even paler, but she managed a faint smile when she saw her son. "Hey, champ," she whispered, her voice raspy. Asher gripped her hand tightly, trying not to cry. "You're going to be okay, right?" Maeve didn't answer. She just squeezed his hand back, as if trying to pass on whatever strength she had left. Outside the room, Colton watched, and that's when he saw something that scared him, the reflection of himself in the boy. A child trying to be strong because life left him no choice. On their way out of the hospital, Asher stopped and looked up at Colton. "Thanks for coming." Colton simply nodded, unsure of what to say. But deep inside, he knew that simple thank you meant more than any contract he'd ever signed. The millionaire never expected that request, but now he understood that what was at stake wasn't just gratitude. It was something much bigger. The hospital had a smell Colton Vance knew he'd never forget. It wasn't just the sharp scent of disinfectant. It was something more subtle, almost invisible. The smell of fear, uncertainty, and waiting. He had never allowed himself to feel the weight of such places, but now he couldn't ignore it. Asher Doyle sat beside him, silent, staring at the cold, sterile floor of the corridor. His mother, Maeve, remained in her hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and machines trying to do the work her body could no longer manage. The doctors said all the right things, but Asher already understood what no one needed to say. Time was running out. At home, Colton tried to act as if everything was normal, but nothing was. Elodie noticed her father was more distant than usual. Not the kind of distance you measure in steps, but the kind that lives in the eyes of someone carrying something too heavy to put into words. One evening, Elodie sat next to him on the couch and asked softly, "Daddy, are you sad?" Colton hesitated. He wasn't used to questions like that. He was used to answering questions about business, results, goals. But sadness? That was unfamiliar territory. "I'm just thinking," he replied, trying to sound convincing. Elodie looked at him with the kind of brutal simplicity only children have. "You think a lot, but you feel very little." Simple words, but they hit harder than any criticism he'd ever received in his life. The next day, Colton went back to the hospital. He found Asher sitting beside his mother's bed, holding her hand as if that simple gesture could hold back the inevitable. Maeve looked fragile, but when she saw Colton, she tried to smile. "You came," she whispered, her voice thinner than a breeze. Colton approached, unsure if he should say anything. Maeve looked into his eyes, with a calmness that didn't match the moment. "I know her time is running out," Asher said suddenly, his voice steady but his gaze distant. "I just wanted one more day." Colton stayed silent. The man who had enough money to buy anything couldn't buy what that boy was asking for. Hours later, Maeve asked to speak with Colton alone. Asher left the room reluctantly, but respected his mother's request. "You know he's going to be alone, don't you?" Maeve said weakly, her breath strained. Colton didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to admit it. "I'm not asking out of pity. I just want you to take care of him. Not because you feel like you owe me anything, but because he deserves to have someone." It was a simple request, but it carried a heavy weight. Because Colton knew what it meant to take on that responsibility. It wasn't just about caring for a boy. It was about opening a space inside himself for something he'd always avoided: love. Back home, Colton lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Maeve's words echoing in his mind. Elodie, sensing her father's silence, came closer and asked, "Are you going to take care of Asher when his mom isn't here anymore?" Colton didn't know how to answer, because, for the first time, he wasn't sure about anything. The millionaire never expected that request, but now he understood that the real weight wasn't in the request itself. It was in what he felt for not knowing how to answer it. The hospital room was steeped in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the monotonous beeping of medical machines. Maeve Doyle lay fragile, her breathing labored, as if every breath was a silent battle. Asher clutched his mother's hand so tightly it was as if he could keep her from leaving just by holding on. The boy who had always seemed strong was now shattered, his silence saying more than any words ever could. Colton Vance leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene, unsure of where he was supposed to be. He had never been the kind of man who knew what to do in situations like this. Business was easy, it had logic, strategy. But here, in that small, dim room, there was none of that. There was only pain, and Colton had never learned how to deal with it. Maeve opened her eyes with great effort. Her gaze was soft but carried an unspoken urgency. She motioned weakly for Colton to come closer. He stepped forward, feeling an unfamiliar weight in his chest, as if he were about to sign the most important contract of his life. Only there was no pen, no fine print. "Take care of him," she whispered, her voice faint but strong enough to be heard. "Not for me, for him." Colton swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything to ease the weight of that request, but nothing came out. He just nodded, not because he was making a promise, but because he knew promises aren't made with words. Hours later, Maeve was gone. There was no drama, no grand farewell, just the flat, continuous tone of the heart monitor, followed by an even more deafening silence. Asher stood still, staring at his mother without shedding a tear. The tears didn't come. There was no room for them. The emptiness was too vast. The funeral was simple, just as Maeve would have wanted. Few people, few words. Colton was there, but he felt like a stranger, out of place among those who had truly known Maeve. Asher remained silent the entire time, his eyes fixed on the ground. After the burial, Colton tried to talk to him. "If you'd like, you can stay at my place for a while." Asher looked at him with a hardness Colton had never seen in the boy's eyes. "I don't need your charity." Those words hurt more than Colton cared to admit, because he knew it wasn't charity. It was fear. Fear of failing, of not knowing how to be what Asher needed. In the days that followed, Asher disappeared. He wasn't selling candy anymore. No one in the neighborhood had seen him. Colton searched for him, but it was as if the boy had vanished. One day, while driving aimlessly, Colton spotted a familiar figure sitting on a park bench. It was Asher, the candy bag beside him, staring at nothing. Colton pulled over and approached. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though the concern in his voice betrayed him. Asher shrugged. "Just existing." Colton sat beside him, saying nothing for a while. The silence between them was more comfortable than the words they couldn't seem to find. "You think I don't know what it's like to be alone?" Colton finally said, his voice low. "My dad left too, but in a different way. He was there, but he was never really there. And I spent my whole life trying not to feel that. But it never worked." Asher didn't respond. He just sat there, listening, his gaze fixed on some distant point. "I don't know how to be what you need," Colton continued, "but I can try. Not because I owe you anything, but because I want to." Asher finally looked at him, his eyes filled with something that wasn't anger or sadness. It was hope, a small flicker, but enough. The millionaire never expected that request. But now he knew that some promises don't need to be spoken. They're kept simply by showing up. Time passed, but not as a relief. It just moved on, indifferent to the pain Asher Doyle carried. After Maeve's death, the boy seemed to have built an invisible wall around himself, a space no one could enter. He still sold candy, but the spark in his eyes, the one that stubbornly shone even in tough times, had vanished. Colton Vance watched from a distance. He wanted to do more, but he didn't know how. The man who had control over everything in life found himself lost when it came to something that didn't fit into contracts or spreadsheets. The heart of a boy who had lost his world. One morning, Colton parked his car near the park where Asher usually sat. The boy was there, on the same bench, the bag of candy beside him, his gaze empty, lost in a place no one could reach. Colton approached slowly and sat next to him without saying a word. He just sat there, because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. After a few minutes, Asher broke the silence. "Why are you still here?" Colton stared ahead, avoiding the boy's eyes. "Because you're here." Asher frowned, confused by the simplicity of the answer. "You don't owe me anything." Colton took a deep breath. "I know. But some things we do not because we owe, but because they matter." The boy stayed quiet, letting those words sink in. The wind blew gently, rustling the dry leaves scattered on the ground. "I don't know how to be a father," Colton continued, finally turning to face Asher. "I wasn't a good dad to Elodie. I didn't have a good dad myself, but I'm here. Not because I know what to do, but because I want to try." Asher stared at the ground for a moment, then softly whispered, "I just wanted someone who wouldn't leave." The words hit Colton with a force no ordinary phrase ever could, because he knew exactly what that meant. The fear of being left behind. The fear of not being enough for someone to stay. Colton reached out his hand to Asher, not as a grand gesture, but as a simple, human invitation. The boy looked at the outstretched hand, hesitated for a second, then took it. There were no emotional speeches, no solemn promises. Just a firm handshake that said, "I'm here. And I'm staying." The days that followed became a new routine. Asher started living with Colton and Elodie, not as a stranger. They adjusted little by little, through small gestures. Sharing breakfast, quick chats before bed, an unexpected laugh in the middle of the day. Colton learned that being a father wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being there when the questions came. It was about listening, even when the other person didn't want to talk. And most of all, it was about staying, even when everything felt too hard. One night, while Elodie was asleep and Asher was sitting on the porch, Colton walked over and stood beside him. The boy looked up at the dark sky and asked, "Do you think my mom would be proud?" Colton didn't hesitate. I'm sure she would. Asher gave a small smile, that kind of smile that might seem small but is filled with meaning, because deep down, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The millionaire never expected that request, and now he knew the greatest gift he ever received wasn't something he bought. It was someone he chose to care for. Who's the person who taught you the value of presence, even without saying a word? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our emotional stories. Watch the next video popping up on your screen now.